All right, well, thanks for being here, everybody. My name is Dana Larsen, and I'm going to be talking tonight about how we can change the cannabis laws in British Columbia through the Sensible BC campaign. So I'm going to assume if you're here or if you're watching this that you already support changing the cannabis laws. And so I'm not going to talk so much about the benefits of medicinal cannabis and the amazing therapeutic properties of the cannabis plant, and I'm not going to talk so much about industrial hemp or the environmental and economic benefits of growing more cannabis hemp in our country, and I'm not really going to touch on so much the harms of prohibition even and how much damage these laws have caused across Canada and especially here in BC. What I'm going to talk about is how we can change the laws and the struggle over the last few decades to get these laws changed and to liberate the cannabis plant and the culture that surrounds it. And I've been involved in this for about 20 years, most of my adult life. And as a student, I started a club at university called the League for Ethical Action on Drugs at Simon Fraser, where I was a student. When I graduated from there, I went to work for Mark Emery, and I was editor of Cannabis Culture magazine for 10 years. And in that time, I had the chance to learn a lot about the cannabis plant and the social and political aspects that surround it. During that time, in 2000 and 2001, I helped form the Canadian Marijuana Party and the BC Marijuana Party, and I ran as a candidate for both of those. I joined the NDP in 2003, and I created a group called End Prohibition that works within the NDP to develop better policies around cannabis and around drug issues. And I also helped open the Vancouver Seed Bank, and more recently in 2008, I opened the Vancouver Medicinal Cannabis Dispensary, and we serve about 4,000 patients now from 2 locations in the Lower Mainland. And during all this time, people have often said to me, Dana, what are you getting so worked up about? It's inevitable these laws are going to change. It's going to happen. It's inevitable that marijuana is going to be legalized. And to that I say that nothing is inevitable, and that the only way to make change is through hard work, through effort, sacrifice, time and money and energy. These are the things that are needed to really make political change. And I feel in many ways where we are now is very similar to where we were in the late 1970s. People thought that marijuana was about to be legalized any day in the late 1970s. And we had 2 Canadian prime ministers. We had Pierre Trudeau from the Liberals and Joe Clark from the Conservatives, both saying it was time to change the marijuana laws in Canada. The US, we had Jimmy Carter talking about the need to reform the marijuana laws. And many American states were having referendums and voting to decriminalize possession at the state level. And yet a whole generation has gone by, and for the most part, these laws have only gotten worse. And so that could easily happen again where we are now. We cannot be complacent in this. And yet, we have had a lot of successes over the last 20 years when it comes to changing the laws, and more importantly, to opening up our culture and to making these positive things happen. 20 years ago, we weren't growing any cannabis hemp in Canada. And now, hemp has been grown across the country. It could be grown more widely, and it's still too restricted by red tape, but nevertheless, we've got a thriving hemp industry in Canada. That's something we can be proud of. And 20 years ago when I first got involved in this, medical marijuana was not widely available, and most people were not even aware of the amazing medicinal and therapeutic benefits of cannabis. And now our government's growing marijuana, admittedly low quality marijuana, and nevertheless our government's growing marijuana for patients, and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of patients across the country are able to access medical marijuana through a dispensary. Even though they're in the gray area of the law, we've made a lot of progress there. And even, harm reduction devices like bongs and pipes and vaporizers were not widely available at all in Canada. And even though that law still remains on the books, Section 462.2 of the Criminal Code, which bans even books and information as well as paraphernalia of any kind, these items are now widely available across Canada, in large part thanks to Mark Emery, who helped get that industry going and open up Canada's real first major bong shop and make those things available. So now people don't have to use a tin can with holes punched in it to smoke their cannabis. They can use a clean medical grade glass pipe or a high quality vaporizer. And so we've seen a lot of successes, but for almost all of these things, the laws themselves have not changed. It's been our ability to get the law to be not enforced or to be ignored in certain areas. And so in Vancouver and Toronto and Victoria, there's a growing number of dispensaries, and yet in other cities and towns in BC and across Canada, dispensaries get raided and shut down. And so it really depends on where you're located, because these laws still remain on the books. And when it comes to bongs and pipes and cannabis seeds and these things, it's the same situation where people can get away with selling these things and the law is largely ignored but it remains on the books, and it can be enforced again at any time if they choose to do so. And so when we look at how the laws have actually been changed, in Canada, we haven't really succeeded in changing the laws. In fact, for the most part, the laws have gotten worse and worse over the last 20 years. And most recently, on the same day that Washington and Colorado had their wonderful referendums to legalize cannabis at the state level, the Stephen Harper government implemented their mandatory minimum sentences for small number of cannabis plants. And we're going to see an increasing number of small-scale marijuana users and growers being imprisoned in Canada over the next few years. And so when I look at the successes we've had in the U.S., Washington and Colorado were very important, where they were able to have a referendum and change their laws. And the same day they did that, in Massachusetts, they became the 18th state to legalize medical access to cannabis. And that's an average of more than one a year since 1996, when California first had their referendum to legalize medical marijuana in their state, and made history by becoming the first state to do so. And in all of these instances where the law has been changed at the state level in the U.S., it has always been through a referendum. It has never been the government saying, we're going to make this change because we recognize it's time to change the laws. In fact, it's been the opposite. In every case, the state governments have campaigned against these referendums, and they've passed anyways. So in Washington and Colorado, the governors of those states are now in the position of having to support and implement legislation that they actually campaigned against and tried to not make happen. And so it seems to me that the only way to really make these laws change is through a referendum system where we can write our own law, get it on the ballot, and make it happen. And British Columbia is the only Canadian province that has such a system. It's very difficult to get something on the ballot in Canada, and I'll come back to that. But nevertheless, British Columbia is the only province where the citizens of that province can get together, can write their own law, can gather signatures, force a vote on it, and put that law into force at the grassroots citizen level, regardless of what their political leaders want to do. So I got together with a fellow named Kirk Tusaw. Kirk's a brilliant lawyer who's won us many important victories in the courts. He's helped to expand access to medical cannabis and curb some of the excesses of Harper's war on drugs with his court battles. And Kirk and I got together and we tried to figure out what we could do as a province to change these laws. And we wrote a piece of legislation called the Sensible Policing Act. Now, the Sensible Policing Act will essentially decriminalize cannabis possession in British Columbia and start us on the path towards a legally regulated system. People will say to me, well, how can you do that when these are federal laws? What can British Columbia do as a province to change these federal laws? And that's true. These are federal laws. In British Columbia, we can't fully legalize and regulate cannabis without a change first of the federal law. But British Columbia, like every province, has jurisdiction over the policing and over the administration of justice in their province. And that goes for the RCMP, for municipal police, for transit police. All those officers are under the authority of the provincial attorney general. And they're all considered officers of British Columbia. They're all considered to be under British Columbia jurisdiction. And so it is entirely within the jurisdiction, and really it's the right and responsibility of the BC Attorney General to set the priorities for the police in the province, to tell them where to focus their resources, where not to focus their resources, and what we as a province want to see them doing with their policing. And so what the Sensible Policing Act does is it mandates all police in British Columbia to stop spending any time or resources on enforcing, on searching or seizing or detaining or arresting anybody for simple cannabis possession. So although the law stays on the books, the police in British Columbia would make this the absolute lowest priority, such that nobody should be getting charged or searched or detained for cannabis possession. People sometimes say, isn't that the case already? I mean, I thought marijuana was essentially decriminalized in BC already. I was smoking a joint, and the cop just told me to put it out, and he didn't do anything at all. And that could be true, especially if you're living in Vancouver. In Vancouver, the Vancouver Police Department has made a real effort not to lay charges for cannabis possession, and they've made it the lowest priority as part of on their own initiative. And as a result, there is hardly any cannabis possession charges laid in British Columbia. But outside of British Columbia, it's very different. Cannabis possession charges have been skyrocketing over the last 5 or 6 years. In 2005, there was about 1,700 British Columbians charged for simple possession of cannabis. Within 5 years, that number doubled. Shortly after Stephen Harper came into power, that number went up every year. By 2010, it had doubled. Last year, it was 3,700 people that were charged for cannabis possession in British Columbia. That's over 10 people every day. And that's just those who are formally charged for possession. There's about 20,000 incidences every year where police in British Columbia waste their time and energy bothering somebody over simple possession of cannabis when nothing else is happening. And so we want to put an end to that. We want to redirect the police resources. We want to unclog our justice system. We want to take those cannabis users off the front lines of the war on drugs. But we want to do more than that. That's not the final solution to anything, but it's a good first step. We can all recognize that people who use cannabis should not be considered as criminals, and that the police have a lot more other priorities they should be dealing with than people who are smoking a joint, who are otherwise law-abiding citizens. So that's how we start this off. But then we want to go further than that. We want to find a way to fully legally regulate cannabis in British Columbia. So the second part of the Sensible Policing Act, it calls upon the federal government formally to change the cannabis laws so that British Columbia can go further as a province to legalize and regulate cannabis. And you know, that's how we deal with alcohol and tobacco. They're provincial jurisdiction. Although there's some federal laws around these things, ultimately alcohol in terms of age limits, points of sale, taxation, all those kind of things are determined by the provinces. And when we had alcohol prohibition, it wasn't a federal law that prohibited alcohol all across the country. Each province on their own decided if they wanted to make alcohol illegal or not. At different times, different provinces had different policies. And Quebec was the last one in and the first one out of alcohol prohibition in Canada. So the idea is that this is really provincial jurisdiction. We want the federal government to take their hands off of cannabis, maybe keep some laws federally about importing and exporting and labeling and that kind of thing. But for the most part, this is provincial jurisdiction. And so we want the province of British Columbia to ask the federal government to change the law, and then also to launch a commission so that the province can figure out what are the rules and regulations needed to have a legally regulated system for cannabis in British Columbia. We got to figure out the details around that. And now that'll be worked out after this law is passed, but I like the idea of a wine-based model where you can grow some cannabis in your own home for your own use or to share with your friends, that anybody can set up a winery if they want to, anybody can try to get into the cannabis industry, but at the same time, the province is the primary buyer and seller of cannabis products, or of wine products. It will be the same for cannabis, and I think that's the kind of model we want to be working towards. But this legislation will just decriminalize possession and then set up a commission to figure out the details around a legally regulated system. And I guess one thing I should mention when we decriminalize possession of cannabis is how we deal with minors, because we don't want to see people under 19 getting criminal records and being charged, but we felt there should be some kind of limitation there as well. And so what the Sensible Policing Act does is it deals with the minor in possession of cannabis in the exact same way as if it was alcohol. And the legislation specifies that a minor in possession of cannabis can be treated by an officer the same as, but no more severely than, if they had alcohol. So an officer could seize cannabis from a youth and could write them a ticket if they wanted to, but there'd be no arresting, no criminal record, none of those things that can haunt somebody for the rest of their lives, right? And even just being charged and not convicted for cannabis possession can cause a lot of problems. Charges are shared with the American authorities trying to cross the border, even if you've just been charged and never convicted, can be very, very challenging. And so this law would eliminate that and free up a lot of police resources and free up our youth of the fear of a criminal record just for using cannabis. So we have this wonderful law. It would decriminalize cannabis possession in BC. It would start us on the legally regulated path. But how do we get this law passed? How do we make it happen? Well, you know, certainly Christy Clark could pass this law right now if she wanted to. There's no reason that we have to have a referendum. And certainly if Adrian Dix becomes our next premier, he would have the power to pass this law as well. And this is really a nonpartisan issue. We've had a number of Liberal and NDP MLAs come out in favor of changing these laws. It's something that really goes beyond the left and right debate really often in this province. And so, so either one of our leaders could do it, but at the same time, I think they're afraid to do so. And certainly in their recent comments in the media, both of them, Christy Clark will just say, I don't have an opinion on this issue. It's a federal law. I choose not to deal with it. Adrian Dix will say that he supports the criminalization of cannabis, but it's a federal issue and it's not really their place. And we need to change that perspective and make them understand this is a provincial issue where we can make a big difference. But ultimately, I believe we need to follow the example of our American cousins who were able to make such important changes through referendums and use the referendum system in British Columbia to change the law and do it through a grassroots citizens initiative. Now, to get something on the ballot in British Columbia, it's very challenging. It's harder in BC than in any American state to get something on the ballot. You need to collect signatures from 10% of the registered voters in every single one of British Columbia's 85 electoral districts. And you have to do it in a 3-month period. If you just get 9.99% of the registered voters to sign on in one district, you fail. You have to get 10% or more in every single electoral district in a 90-day period. It's very, very challenging to do so. That is why we've only ever had one referendum in our province ever, is because it's so hard to get something on the ballot. But that being said, no one's ever tried with the strategy that we're using before, because you see, the referendum system has fixed election dates. So the next referendum is scheduled for September 2014. And whenever we have those signatures in place, the next referendum would still be held in September 2014. It's separate from the provincial elections. It's separate from everything else. It's its own system. And so what we're doing is right now we haven't started that 90-day clock yet. We're pre-registering our supporters, and we're getting our volunteers and people in place so that when we come to September of this year, September 2013, that's when we're going to start that 90-day clock. And by then, I hope to have thousands of volunteers and hundreds of thousands of supporters registered all around the province, so that when we start that clock, we have our volunteers ready to go, and we can tell our volunteers, here's the 200 people in your area that have already said they're going to sign this initiative. Just go get them, and they're all expecting you to come. Just get them to sign the official form that we need to make this happen. And if we can do that, if we can succeed in getting this on the ballot, we will win that referendum in September 2014. Winning the vote won't be the hard part. The hard part is getting all the signatures that we need in place. And so anybody can register their support by going to sensiblebc.ca and signing up online. But more than that, we need people to get out into their communities, to get their friends and families and coworkers and neighbors registered. We have a sign-up sheet that you can have. They're available in many hemp stores and dispensaries and places like that around BC. But you can also download one from our website. You can take it to your friends and family, coworkers and neighbors, get them to sign on board, get their information, get it into us so that we can build our database up, so that we have a lot of people involved and ready to go for September 2013 when we start collecting those signatures. I can't express how important it is that we build our volunteer base and that we get out there. And you know, I've been to over 36 cities and towns around BC, all around the province, from Prince George to Fernie, from Prince Rupert to Grand Forks. I've been all over this province talking to people, building up supporters, and wherever I go, I send people off with flyers and with sign-up sheets, and they're mailing them into us quite regularly. We're building up a really good base of people here to make this happen. But we got to go further than that, and I can't do it all myself. I need your help when you're watching this. I need you to get involved and to make a difference. Go to sensiblebc.ca, visit our website, find out what you can do. There's a lot people can do from their own homes to make this happen. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You can repost our stuff. But more importantly, I want you to get out into your communities, talk to your friends and family, talk to your neighbors, and build support for the Sensible BC campaign so that we can really make this happen when the time comes. And I just actually wanted to address one thing that I didn't quite mention earlier, was that people will say, well, it's a federal issue, we can't do anything, but actually it's quite common for this to happen in our provinces. And we just had a great example of the provinces standing up to a failed federal law a few years ago, and that was the long gun registry. When the long gun registry was passed, we had 8 provinces across Canada, including British Columbia, in around 2003. 8 provinces stood up and said, we are not going to enforce this long gun registry law. We believe this is a failed law. It's criminalizing otherwise law-abiding citizens. It's costing way more than we thought it was going to cost. Nobody's following it anyways. It's going to waste a lot of police time and resources. We refuse to enforce this law. We're just not going to do it. And British Columbia did that along with 8 other provinces. So if we can stand up against the failed long gun registry, we certainly have the right as a province to stand up against the failed war on cannabis. And you know, when it comes to drug policy, we have the supervised injection site in British Columbia and in Vancouver. And there also, we had a fight over jurisdiction with the federal government wanting to shut it down, and the province of British Columbia saying, no, this saves lives, it saves money, it helps our province, it helps Vancouver. We want to keep the supervised injection site there. And you know what? We went to court and we won. The supervised injection site remains. The gun registry, the long gun registry, is gone. So clearly provinces do have the power and the ability to stand up to the federal government. And when they do, they win. And so we can make this happen here in British Columbia. We can do this as a province together. And we have a very special opportunity over the next few years. The timing of the referendum system and the timing of having so many political leaders coming out over the last few years in support of this. We've had former premiers, attorney generals, all the mayors and city councils in BC recently voted to support what we're calling for, decriminalization of possession and moving as quickly as possible towards legalization of marijuana. but we cannot take it for granted, because even though it seems like things are going really well in some ways, even though I feel like we're closer to legalization than ever before, we must not forget the example of the 1970s when they were so close to changing the law and a whole generation went by and they failed to make that change happen. And at the same time, we're having these wonderful things happen. Those mandatory minimums and the iron fist of the conservative government against prohibition is coming down hard. And certainly there's two paths we can go by. You know, I think that over the next few years, if we can pass the Sensible BC Act, if we can get this legislation in place, if we can punch through the wall of prohibition here in British Columbia, it will spread across Canada and there'll be no stopping it. But if we fail over the next couple of years, if we can't convince our political leaders to change the law, if we can't succeed in getting the signatures that we need to change the law, I can easily see many of these advantages and freedom that we've won being rolled back and being lost. You know, it wouldn't take a lot, a change in government in Vancouver, perhaps a change of government in British Columbia. We could see the dispensaries being shut down. We could see vapor lounges being attacked. We could see things being rolling right back, like what happened in the 1980s when they shut down hundreds of head shops, when they banned magazines, when they banned grow books, when they banned bongs and pipes, and all this stuff was blown back. That could easily happen again as well. And you know, I've got a daughter who's 15 years old, and some of you watching this might have kids of your own or hope to have kids one day. And you know, I hope that we can end this war now and not pass it off to another generation. And I like to imagine a future, and I hope you can imagine this with me, of when you're a grandparent or a great-grandparent, depending how old you are now, and you're with your grandchildren there in your home, and they're getting ready to go to school in the morning, and they're reading their history book, and they're doing their homework, and they turn to you and they say, "Grandma, Granddad, I'm reading in my history book here that this cannabis hemp plant used to be illegal and people used to go to jail for growing this plant. And yet I know that my history book's printed on hemp paper, and I know that our house is built out of hemp fiber board, and I know that the bus that takes me to school runs on hemp fuel, and I know that you use cannabis medicines to help treat the aches and pains of being a senior citizen. So what's with that? How is it that this plant used to be illegal when now we use it so much?" And I want you to be able to say, yeah, it's true. People did used to go to jail for growing that plant and for being involved in the cannabis world. And you know what? I got involved and I made a difference. And when Sensible BC came to my town, I decided I was going to work hard, I was going to collect signatures, and I worked my ass off to make that law change so that you would never have to know what it's like to be harassed or arrested for what herbal medicine you use, or to be jailed for what plant you choose to grow in your garden. Let's make it so that cannabis prohibition is something of the past. Sometimes it seems almost natural. These laws have been in place so long that we've all grown up in a world where cannabis is illegal. And sometimes it seems like that's how it's supposed to be, and that's natural and normal. But I tell you, when we change these cannabis laws, we will look back on the time of cannabis prohibition as a terrible nightmare. And we will see very clearly the harms and the damages that are done every day because of these laws, both in lost opportunity, lost access to this medicine, redirection of police resources, and the great crimes and problems and tragedies that are so deeply entwined through cannabis prohibition. We have this chance now to end this prohibition here in British Columbia and make it spread all across Canada. Let's use that opportunity that we have. Let's get involved. Let's collect signatures. Let's register people. Let's make the Sensible BC campaign a success so we can not have to pass this off to another generation. Instead of having to tell our grandkids, "Oh, I'm sorry you got arrested for that cannabis plant you were growing and now you're going to get a 6-year mandatory minimum sentence." Let's not let that be the future we pass off to our kids. We can do it here. We can do it now, right here in British Columbia through the Sensible BC campaign. Please get involved. Make a difference. Let's change these laws now and forever, starting here in British Columbia. Thank you for watching my talk, and get involved in Sensible BC at sensiblebc.ca.